Welcome to the historian's tome. Tonight, let us journey far back in time, into the shadows between Egypt's mighty kingdoms, into an age wrapped in mystery, silence, and foreign rule. For centuries, the pharaohs reigned over the Nile, but then came a time when that line of kings faltered. Chaos seeped into the land, and in the fertile delta, strange newcomers began to rise. Were they invaders, traders, refugees, or something else entirely? These were the Hyksos, foreign rulers who took the throne of Lower Egypt, not with fire and sword, but with horses, trade, and quiet power. They brought new technologies and a new way of rule. Egypt was no longer just Egyptian. Tonight, we will explore the second intermediate period, a time of division and transformation. A chapter often overlooked, yet one that changed the course of Egyptian history forever. So, settle in, let your eyes grow heavy. As the sands of time shift gently beneath you, we begin our descent into the lost world of the Hyksos. Close your eyes and drift into history. Egypt once stood firm and undivided. Along the Nile, from the cataracts of the south to the marshes of the delta, the kings of the Middle Kingdom ruled with order and clarity. This was a time of unity, when the pharaoh's voice carried across deserts and farmlands alike. Law was respected, temples flourished, trade flowed in all directions, and above all, the sacred principle of ma'at, balance and harmony, kept the world steady. But even the greatest river must change its course. The end of the Middle Kingdom came quietly, without the clash of swords or the rise of a usurper. Pharaoh Sobekneferu, one of Egypt's few ruling queens, passed without a clear heir. Her death marked the conclusion of the 12th dynasty, a line that had once brought peace and prosperity to the land. Without her, there was no strong successor to hold the kingdom together. And so the center began to weaken. The royal court at Ichtawi, once the heartbeat of Egypt, lost its grip over distant regions. Local governors, known as nomarchs, began to act as independent rulers. Some collected their own taxes, others raised militias. Their loyalty to the throne became uncertain. While pharaohs still ruled in name, their actual power was eroding, scattered like sand through the fingers of time. As political unity faded, nature delivered its own blow. For centuries, the Nile had flooded each year like clockwork. Its waters brought life to the fields, nourishing the crops that fed the people. But now the floods became unpredictable. Some years the waters ran too low, leaving fields dry and cracked. Other years the floods were late, or washed away the crops altogether. The farmers who had once relied on the river's rhythm began to suffer. Hunger crept into villages, trade slowed. Trust in the old gods may have begun to waver. In this slow collapse, Egypt was not conquered from without, but hollowed from within. The country fractured into regions. In the south, Upper Egypt clung to native rule. Cities like Thebes continued to honor the pharaohs, though their voices carried less weight with each passing year. The central government could no longer enforce its will across the kingdom. Officials who had once been messengers of the throne were now kings in all but name. Meanwhile, Lower Egypt, the delta, rich with trade routes and farmland, drifted further from the core of Egyptian tradition. The marshy open lands of the north were difficult to control, even in the best of times. Now, with the central power fading, the delta became a world of its own, and into this open space came strangers. At first, their arrival may have seemed ordinary. Foreigners had long traded with Egypt. From the lands of Canaan and Syria, merchants brought timber, copper, wine, and precious oils. In return, Egypt offered gold, grain, linen, and finely crafted goods. These connections were nothing new. For generations, Egypt had looked to the east and welcomed its neighbors. But during the second intermediate period, something shifted. Small groups began to settle in the eastern delta, especially around the city of Avaris. They built homes, raised families, and brought with them their own customs, languages, and gods. These newcomers were not an army. They did not arrive in chariots or armor. Instead, they came gradually, settling among the Egyptians, adapting to life along the Nile, while quietly preserving their own identities. It is here that the seeds of change were planted. Few at the time may have noticed. In a kingdom already distracted by its own decline, the slow rise of foreign influence in the delta was likely seen as a distant concern. But over time, these settlers grew in number and strength. They took on Egyptian titles, learned the local ways, and yet remained distinct. They were known to the Egyptians as the Hyksos, rulers of foreign lands. Later generations would call them the Hyksos. But in these early days, they were simply a presence, quiet, growing, and waiting. The twilight of the Middle Kingdom was not marked by conquest or rebellion. It was a dimming of light, a slow unraveling, a moment in history when the old world gave way to something new, and in the gathering shadows, the future was already taking root. As Egypt drifted into disunity, its frontiers grew quieter and thinner. Far from the halls of Thebes and the temples of Middle Egypt, the Eastern Delta became a land of openness and opportunity. It was here, among the reeds and winding waters, that new people began to appear. Their arrival did not come with the sound of war. It came slowly like the rising tide, with traders, families, and artisans crossing into the Nile Delta. The Egyptians would later call them the Hyksos. In the ancient tongue, they were known as the Hyksos, a name meaning rulers of foreign lands. It was not a term that implied savagery or chaos. It was a title that hinted at status, at influence, at leadership. These were not merely outsiders. They were people who had brought with them the ability to rule. But who were they? Most scholars believe the Hyksos were of Canaanite or Amorite descent, hailing from the lands to the northeast. This region, which includes parts of modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, was a crossroads of ancient cultures. These people shared Semitic languages, built fortified cities, and worshiped gods unfamiliar to the Egyptian pantheon. Their world was older than many believed, shaped by centuries of trade, migration, and survival. They came into Egypt during a time of openness. With central authority weakened, there were fewer eyes watching the borders. The Delta, rich in resources but far from the hands of the southern kings, became a natural place for settlement. Archaeological discoveries point to this movement. In places like Tel el-Daba, later known as Avaris, pottery styles shift. Tombs begin to reflect foreign customs. Burials include donkey skeletons and weapons not typical of Egyptian traditions. These changes do not appear all at once. They build up, layer by layer, over decades. Avaris soon became more than a village. It grew into a center of activity. Its people spoke different languages, wore different clothing, and practiced different rites, yet they were not isolated. Egyptian culture mingled with theirs. Some adopted Egyptian names, others worshipped Egyptian gods alongside their own. The lines between native and newcomer began to blur. Trade played a central role in this blending. Long before any political takeover, there were ships and caravans moving between Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean. Cedar wood came from Lebanon. Copper flowed in from Cyprus. Oils, incense, textiles, and livestock all moved along the coastal routes. In return, Egypt sent grain, gold, papyrus, and linen. These routes connected Egypt not only to its neighbors, but to Mesopotamia and beyond. In such a world, the presence of foreign merchants in the Nile Delta was not unusual. What was unusual was how they stayed. Some may have arrived as refugees. The ancient Near East was never still. Droughts, invasions, and internal conflicts could have driven people to seek shelter in Egypt. Others might have come by invitation. In times of weakness, Egyptian leaders could have welcomed skilled metalworkers, horse trainers, or builders to strengthen their own positions. Still others may have been opportunists, recognizing that Egypt's vulnerability made it fertile ground for quiet conquest. There is no single explanation. The Hyksos presence was not a singular event. It was a process, a slow and subtle shift, born from necessity, ambition, and chance. They did not need to storm the gates of Egyptian cities. They simply needed to settle, prosper, and wait. In time, their numbers grew. So did their confidence. They established their own rulers, began to collect taxes, and built palaces that blended Eastern and Egyptian styles. They began to act not only as residents, but as leaders. In the eyes of their people, they were kings. In the eyes of the Egyptians, they were something new. Foreigners with crowns, strangers who claimed divine right. Yet their rule was not defined by violence in its early stages. It was shaped by adaptation. The Hyksos learned to govern the land they had entered. And Egypt, fractured and distracted, allowed it to happen. They did not come with a thunderclap. They came with skill, trade, patience, and vision. And soon they would no longer be visitors. They would be rulers. In the quiet heart of the Delta, far from the gaze of Thebes, something unexpected had taken root. What began as a growing community of settlers and merchants was now becoming something far greater. The Hyksos, once seen as foreigners and guests, were no longer just part of Egypt. They were now shaping its future. At the center of this transformation stood the city of Avaris. Located in the eastern Nile Delta, Avaris was not a typical Egyptian capital. It stood closer to the trade routes of the Levant and the coast, a place where ships from Canaan and Syria could arrive with ease. Its architecture reflected this openness. Temples and houses showed both Egyptian and foreign designs. The gods worshipped there included both Ra and Baal. In its markets, one could hear Egyptian spoken alongside Semitic tongues. Avaris was not merely a city, it was a symbol of a new cultural balance. From this diverse and thriving city, a new dynasty emerged. Known to us as the 15th dynasty, it marked the first time in Egyptian history that a line of foreign rulers held the throne. The first of these kings was Seleucus. His name appears in later sources, described as the one who organized the Hyksos power and established their royal court at Avaris. Seleucus and his successors ruled not as conquerors from outside, but as pharaohs from within. These Hyksos kings have adopted the titles of Egyptian royalty. They styled themselves as sons of Ra and used the symbols of divine kingship. Their monuments bore hieroglyphs. Their officials followed Egyptian court traditions, yet they retained their identity. They honored their ancestral gods and kept certain customs from their homelands. The result was a hybrid court, both Egyptian and foreign, both familiar and strange. Under Hyksos rule, new technologies and practices entered Egypt. Among the most important was the horse-drawn chariot. Lightweight and swift, it gave their armies a mobility that the older Egyptian forces lacked. Alongside it came the composite bow, a powerful weapon made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew. These tools would later become standard in Egyptian warfare, but it was the Hyksos who introduced them to the Nile. Their influence was not limited to the battlefield. Agricultural techniques shifted, with new crops likely brought from the eastern Mediterranean. Advances in bronze metallurgy improved tools and weapons. Certain artistic styles, such as seal carving and pottery, began to reflect foreign aesthetics. The Hyksos were not simply occupiers, they were innovators. They left their mark in every layer of life. Despite the reach of their power, the Hyksos did not rule all of Egypt. Their control centered on Lower Egypt, especially the Delta and parts of Middle Egypt. To the south, the ancient city of Thebes remained under native rule. There, Egyptian dynasties continued in parallel, preserving traditions and maintaining their own line of kings. The country was now divided not through civil war, but through an uneasy coexistence. This balance brought a strange kind of stability. For a time, Egypt functioned under two centers of power. In the north, the Hyksos reigned from Avaris, blending foreign skill with local tradition. In the south, Egyptian rulers held on to their culture and memory of unity. Trade continued, temples remained active, and in many parts of the land, daily life carried on. There were Egyptians who served the Hyksos court. There were Hyksos nobles who dressed like Egyptians and sent offerings to Egyptian gods. The boundaries between native and foreign were not always clear, and that was perhaps the most surprising part of their rule. The Hyksos did not erase what came before. They built upon it. They adapted, reshaped, and contributed. Their time and power was not simply a period of interruption. It was a chapter of transformation. In the quiet spaces between dynasties, the story of Egypt was still unfolding. And at its center, in a city born of two worlds, a new kind of pharaoh sat on the throne. History often remembers invasions as swift and brutal events. We picture cities set aflame, temples toppled, and kings dragged from their thrones. But not all invasions arrive on chariots. Some settle in slowly, some take root in silence. The Hyksos' presence in Egypt did not begin with destruction. It began with transformation. By the time the Hyksos fully controlled Lower Egypt, much of their rule had already blended into Egyptian life. The land they governed was still fertile. The Nile still flowed. Farmers continued their routines, planting barley and wheat along its banks. Artisans carved stone, shaped pottery, and wove linen as they always had. Life for the common person remained much the same, even as foreign rulers sat on the throne. In cities like Avaris, the change was more visible. Avaris had become a cosmopolitan capital where Syrian architecture stood beside Egyptian shrines. Markets sold goods brought by land and sea. Copper from the east, oils from Canaan, and horses from the northern plains were exchanged for Egypt's grain and gold. Scribes recorded transactions in Egyptian script, while spoken languages varied from house to house. It was a place of blending, not breaking. Among the ruling class, there were Egyptians who served the Hyksos court. Some did so out of ambition. Others may have done so to preserve stability. High-ranking Egyptians were appointed as governors, administrators, and even military officials. These positions allowed them to maintain status and influence. Whether they truly accepted the Hyksos or simply tolerated them is harder to know. In times of divided rule, loyalty can be as flexible as it is silent, but resentment may have simmered beneath the surface. In Thebes and Upper Egypt, where native dynasties still held power, the Hyksos were seen not as partners but as occupiers. Yet even this opposition took time to grow. For many years, the Hyksos rule was peaceful. It was not a time of rebellion or destruction, but of adaptation and cooperation. Religion, a cornerstone of Egyptian identity, also changed under the Hyksos. The newcomers brought their own gods. Chief among them was Baal, a storm deity from the Levant. Baal's image began to appear alongside traditional Egyptian gods like Ra and Osiris. Temples in the Delta honored both Egyptian and foreign deities. In some cases, gods were fused or reinterpreted. A new pantheon began to take shape, one that reflected the blended culture of the time. This religious tolerance was not weakness. It was a form of political intelligence. The Hyksos rulers understood the value of honoring Egyptian beliefs while introducing their own. By participating in Egyptian rituals, by dressing in Egyptian robes and using Egyptian titles, they eased the path to acceptance. They did not attempt to erase the past. They tried to become part of it. Even so, myths would later paint the Hyksos as destroyers. In texts written long after their fall, they were accused of burning cities and defiling temples. But archaeology tells a more complex story. The layers of Avaris show no clear sign of violent conquest at the start of Hyksos rule. There is no widespread evidence of destruction or mass disruption. What we find instead is continuity. Of course, not all was equal. The Hyksos ruled as a foreign elite. Their access to power, wealth, and military strength gave them advantages over native Egyptians. And yet they governed in ways that did not overturn society. They worked within the existing systems, modifying them slowly. They shaped Egypt to fit their image, but they did not shatter it. Craftsmanship also evolved under Hyksos influence. Metalwork improved, especially in bronze tools and weapons. Pottery designs became more varied, reflecting styles from across the Eastern Mediterranean. Horses, once unknown in Egypt, became part of military and ceremonial life. These changes would leave a lasting mark on Egyptian civilization, even after the Hyksos were gone. To live under the Hyksos was not to live under chaos. It was to live in a time of quiet change. Daily life carried on with new rhythms and subtle differences. Foreign hands guided Egyptian traditions, and the people adapted. The Nile continued to rise and fall. Crops were planted and harvested. Children were born under new gods and new kings. In the long view of history, the Hyksos did not simply invade. They settled. They ruled. And for a time, they became part of Egypt's story. For a time, Egypt accepted its divided soul. In the north, the Hyksos ruled from the bustling city of Avaris, their authority stretching across the delta and parts of Middle Egypt. In the south, native kings held their ground in Thebes, keeping alive the traditions of old Egypt. Between them lay a fragile balance. It was not peace, but it was not yet war. But resentment, once planted, takes root slowly. It grows in whispers and in silence, in the careful words of priests and the watchful eyes of generals. The people of Thebes did not forget the stories of their ancestors. They remembered a time when one king ruled from the cataracts of Nubia to the shores of the Mediterranean. They remembered unity, order, and the divine role of the pharaoh. and they watched with clenched patience as foreigners wore their crowns and spoke in foreign tongues. In Thebes, a new dynasty had risen. Known to us as the 17th dynasty, these native kings were not yet powerful, but they were determined. They controlled Upper Egypt and ruled from a city still rich with memory. The temples of Karnak still echoed with prayers to Amun. The scribes still recorded offerings to the gods. And the southern court, Yasamahum, though smaller than that of Avaris, became a flame kept alive in the dark. Among these kings was Seqenen-Retau. His name would become etched in legend, not only for how he ruled, but for how he died. Records of his reign are limited, but his mummy tells a story the texts do not. When his body was discovered, his skull bore the marks of brutal wounds. Cracks and gashes suggested a violent death, possibly struck down in battle. He may have died fighting the Hyksos. He may have died leading his people into open resistance. If Seqenen-Retau began the fight, it was his sons who would carry it forward. One of them, Kamose, took the first bold step toward war. He did not speak in riddles. He did not plead for peace. Kamose stood before his court and declared his purpose plainly. He called the Hyksos invaders. He called them foreigners who held the land in shame. His words burned with fury. "I shall drive out the Asiatics," he said. "I shall sweep them from the land of my fathers." His proclamations were not just words. Kamose began to prepare for war. Thebes trained soldiers and gathered weapons. Armies were built with both traditional footmen and new units adapted to the style of Hyksos warfare. Chariots were no longer foreign. They had become tools of liberation. Siege tactics were studied. Walls were reinforced. The South was waking, not with panic, but with purpose. Kamose launched military campaigns against the Hyksos. He marched north, challenging their strongholds and attacking their allies. Some records claim he captured territory near Avaris. Others describe battles with rival Egyptian rulers who had allied with the Hyksos for safety or survival. Kamose saw no room for compromise. The land had to be cleansed. Egypt, in his eyes, must belong to Egyptians once more. Yet his campaign was not decisive. Kamose died before the war could be won, but his efforts changed the course of history. He transformed quiet resentment into open defiance. He turned patience into pressure. His death did not end the resistance. It sharpened it. Thebes was no longer a corner of the past. It had become a force of reckoning. Under Kamose's younger brother, a prince named Ahmose, the final phase of rebellion would begin. But that story was still unfolding. For now, Egypt stood on the edge of something vast. The North and South no longer tolerated one another. The quiet years were ending. In the temples of Thebes, prayers were no longer just for harvest or health. They were for victory. In the fields, workers became soldiers, and along the banks of the Nile, the sound of oars and the clang of bronze signaled a country preparing for a fight. The storm had not yet broken, but the air was thick with the weight of what was to come. In Thebes, the memory of Kamose still lingered. His defiance had lit the flame of resistance, but it would be his younger brother who carried that fire into conquest. That brother was Ahmose, the future founder of the 18th dynasty. Young when Kamose died, Ahmose grew up in a land still divided, still wounded by the presence of foreign kings. But unlike those before him, he would not stop short of victory. Ahmose inherited more than a throne. He inherited a mission. The Hyksos still ruled the delta from Avaris, holding the north with wealth and soldiers. But their power had peaked. Their influence was shrinking. The southern armies were gaining strength, and under Ahmose's command, Egypt would fight not only for its freedom, but for its rebirth. The final campaign against the Hyksos was long and difficult. Avaris, their capital, was a fortified city, well defended and supplied. Ahmose laid siege to it with determination. His army, trained in the new methods of warfare, used weapons once introduced by the Hyksos themselves. Chariots rolled into battle. Archers fired composite bows with deadly force. Bronze swords clashed beneath foreign walls. After repeated assaults and heavy fighting, Avaris finally fell. The Hyksos were driven from their stronghold. But Ahmose did not stop there. He pursued the remnants of their leadership into southern Canaan, determined to erase their hold entirely. Egyptian forces crossed the border and captured cities beyond the Sinai. In this campaign, Egypt was no longer defending itself. It had become the aggressor. When Amos returned, he did so as more than a king. He was hailed as a restorer of order, a unifier of the two lands. For the first time in generations, Egypt was whole again. From the far south of Nubia to the shores of the Mediterranean, the land bowed once more to a native pharaoh. Temples were rebuilt, records were rewritten, offerings were made to the gods in celebration of a kingdom restored. Yet something had changed. The Hyksos were gone, but their influence remained. The weapons they had brought, the chariots, the metallurgy, the military tactics, were now fully part of Egypt's arsenal. Their methods of diplomacy and trade shaped the way Egypt dealt with its neighbors. The very tools that had once threatened Egypt were now helping to build its future. And what a future it would be. Ahmos's victory marked the beginning of the new kingdom, the most powerful and expansive era in Egyptian history. The pharaohs of this age would become empire builders. They would push Egypt's borders into foreign lands, conquer territories, and fill their treasuries with tribute from afar. Egypt became not just a kingdom, but an imperial force. The warrior kings who followed Ahmose, like Thutmose and Ramses, carried forward the legacy that had begun with the defeat of the Hyksos. This was the great irony. The invaders had been defeated, but their legacy lived on. Egypt did not return to what it had been before. It became something new, something greater, forged from both resistance and adaptation. So who truly won? Was it the Egyptians, who reclaimed their land and their throne? Was it the Hyksos, whose ideas and technologies reshaped a civilization? Or was it the fusion of both, a blending of worlds that produced a stronger nation? History does not always offer clear answers. What begins in conflict often ends in connection. What seems like victory can carry the fingerprints of those who are conquered. In the end, the story of the Hyksos is not just about invasion or rebellion. It is about transformation. It is about the ways in which cultures meet, collide, and change one another. Egypt emerged from this chapter not broken, but renewed. And in the stillness after war, the Nile flowed on, carrying with it the weight of memory and the promise of tomorrow. The story of the Hyksos reminds us that history is rarely black and white. Rulers rise and fall, but cultures blend and persist. Sleep. Now, traveler of time, the Nile flows on.